morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. My name is Rick Torrance, and I'm the Managing Director for the Office of Crime Victims Advocacy at the Department of Commerce. And it is an honor to be the MC today at this event to acknowledge the National Crime Victims' Rights Week. Appropriately, it is this week. As is the case with events taking place at the Department of Labor and Industries, we take a moment at the start of events to think about safety. In the event of emergency, please stay calm and note where you are in relation to the nearest exit and head toward the gathering points in the parking lot. So as you know, today's event is focused on those people that are impacted by crime and violence. And we know the lasting impact that crime and violence can have on individuals, families, and communities. Our intent today is to shed light on those impacts and to let crime victims know that support is available and to share stories of courage and perseverance. The national theme for this year's event is honoring our past and creating hope for the future. So today we're going to talk about what crime victim advocacy efforts are happening in our state, both in the past, currently, and into the future. We're going to start today with opening remarks from our host, Labor and Industries Director Joel Sachs.
Morning, everybody. I want to welcome all of you here on behalf of our departments and thank you for pausing what for so many of you are your busy lives to come together and spend a moment reflecting on the incredibly important work that you do. As the host of this event for the last couple of years, we feel honored to help be the convener and bring everybody together for this event. And I just want to spend a minute talking about the why. When we think about what we do here at Labor and Industries, we kind of define ourselves as having two primary focuses. The first is waking up every morning thinking about how can we prevent bad things from happening to people. And then the second is if something bad happens to someone, what can we be doing as an organization to help them recover? And when we talk about helping people recover, we are always honored that the legislature asked us to administer the Crime Victims Program any number of years ago, because that really is the essence of what that program is all about. The second reason that we're so honored to have you here today is a little inside L&I secret. The Crime Victims Program within L&I leads the way in teaching the rest of the organization some incredibly important lessons. And I just want to share one with you. That what we're trying to do as an organization is recognize that we're better together, that we have to work collaboratively in strategic partnerships. And today's events and the work that the Crime Victims Program does demonstrates the value of coming together. So I want to thank all of you from the variety of organizations that you're with, that have your willingness to recognize that you can be working collaboratively to serve people who absolutely need our support and services in order to effectively recover from events of which they really had no knowledge, for which they were not expecting to happen. I mean, you think about being a victim of a crime and how it just transforms your life. I'm also proud to tell you that we've been working hard within the program. This is a piece of good news. I'm hoping I'm not jinxing us. We've been working with the legislature to try to help them implement a bill that they passed a couple of years ago to increase our ability to pay providers when they treat crime victims. And at least at the moment, the House of Representatives and the Senate in their proposed budgets follow the recommendation of the governor and have provided us that funding so we can actually increase the funding to providers to encourage them to actually treat crime victims, which interestingly gets to a story that I learned about in preparing for today's events, which is how the Crime Victims Program actually got started. And so go back to about 1973, and a woman by the name of Pat Hemingway was slowly tugged her wheelchair into a hearing in the legislature to testify about being shot in a robbery. She told the committee that she was walking with a friend in the Seattle Arboretum in 1972 when the robbers demanded their purses. She said she took too long for one of the robbers, who shot her in the neck, severing her spinal cord. And she had to spend, and as a result of the injury, had to have 24-hour care. Now, while she told the committee her story, one of the legislators sat reading a newspaper. Now, we shake our heads and think how inappropriate, but sometimes we make the best of bad situations. And what my understanding is, part of what wound up happening is there was enough of an outcry about that legislator's behavior and action that the program actually got started. And so the reason I tell that story is how important it is for all of us that when something bad does occur, how do we take advantage of that to be able to forward those things that are so important to us and take advantage of those circumstances to help make things better? And maybe in some ways, the fact that one legislator chose to be inattentive to someone who deserved and earned all of our respect may have resulted in us being able to serve and help so many thousands of crime victims over the years. Our program here at LNI, just in the last year, served more than 5,500 people, providing about $14 million in benefits, which included wage replacements and medical services, and unfortunately, in some cases, burial services. We've helped nearly 3,500 girls and women who face sexual assault and other violence, and we've covered the cost of about 4,000 sexual assault exams, all of which were a direct result of both an appropriation from the legislature and a willingness of the legislature to have us fund these incredibly important programs. So in some odd way, I am thankful to that one legislator who chose to act in a disrespectful way for the unintended positive impact that he has had over generations. But most importantly, I am thankful today to all of you and that your willingness to wake up each and every morning and serve victims of crime. And to victims of crime, I want to let on behalf of all of us here at the department, all of us in the community, that we believe that we've got your back, that we believe that what we want to do is take that horrific occurrence that happened in your life and figure out how can we surround you with the support to make things just a little bit better. And that's our commitment here at the agency, and I know that's our commitment as a community, and thank you for collaborating with us to make the world just a little bit better for the people who truly deserve it. So thank you. I now have the great honor to introduce our special guest, and that is Mr. Hanford Mccloud, a tribal council member from the Nisqually Indian tribe and the former executive director of the Leshai Heritage Foundation. Mr. Mccloud is a weaver, a carver, and a keeper of the culture for the tribe. And as of 2018, the tribe has more than 1,000 members and covers nearly 1,500 acres of land. And Mr. Mccloud, I would say that for us here at LNI, it's particularly important to us that you're here today because the grounds that we're here, where we stand today are actually ancestral lands. And so we are honored to have a building that serves people on ancestral lands, and we thank you for joining us today.
I'll just use the mic. How about that? Good morning. Good morning. My name is Howikwadai Hanford Mccloud from the Nisqually Indian tribe. I currently sit on 6th position of our council. And it's good to be here at this event. You know, it's an honor to be able to come here and speak on behalf of my people and welcome you to this territory. You know, hoping everybody has a great event. Looks like it's been a great week of this honoring. And you know, coming here this morning, I knew that it was one of those battles that I have within myself of speaking publicly. You know, and talking about some of the history that comes from here. The pain, right? But it's one way of healing from that. So I originally wasn't going to do this, and then I originally turned around and said, yes, I would more than be honored to come down and do this talk, because it does go back to our people and to our upbringing, also when we start getting into some of the history here. And I don't have a lot of time to give you a history lesson. And what I was thinking of as I was reading this, honoring the past, creating hope for the future, I realized I was that hope for my grandma. Her name is Janet McLeod. My grandfather was Don McLeod Sr., And I may speak a little bit loud about it because it gets a little emotional when you start talking about it. And one way I found to deal with that is how we speak to one another. We don't have that conversation anymore. And my grandma, who was one of those warrior women who stood up and fought for that, but she came from that victim in the streets of Seattle. I read her book. I only got through half of it because it was very, very painful to hear that. She never told us about her history. She never talked about it. She talked a little bit about it, but a lot of what she did was the work. And the work had to do with the women and the youth and bringing that together. You know, we have our elders, we have our youth, we have the ones in the middle, as myself. And that job or that duty that we have, you know, in that village setting. My grandmother bought property in Yelm, 1959 or something like that, because my grandfather worked really hard to get this money for my grandmother, to do the work she was doing. And I talk so much about it because she is that foundation for myself, to be on council, to do this work, to talk about that, you know, to talk about some of that past. And I explain that to my kids in our schools because they are very receptive to that conversation when we start talking about it. They can relate to the story or to the situation. And then they want to know, well, how do we get past that? You know, I've been sober myself 15 years. I put away that alcohol and that drug that suppressed our people for a long time. My dad was one of them. So there's always been that hate and that anger there, right? That's always been there. But it's the fight. And before the fight, our people, we were very, very kind right here in this area right here. Welcoming. We welcomed everybody into this territory. Squally means people of the river. The coat I wear on my back, Taquotma, means don't forget the water. That story there was told by Grandpa Billy Frank Sr., who was told to him as a young man. And these stories, they go back thousands of years. In our upbringing, I call it, especially here on the res, you know, grew up on the Nisqually Reservation all my life, went to school in Yelm. My father, the same, because my grandfather bought that property in Yelm when my dad was a young man. But he went through that kind of like that crime right there on our reservation, you know, especially in Nisqually. You know, and I'm going to circle back around to the beginning of that story. You know, I kind of get jumped around a lot when I talk. So usually I got somebody in the background kind of giving me the high sign and stay online here, because there's a lot of it there that I love to talk about once I get past a lot of the hurt and the anger that I like to talk about. But that's that healing right here. That's that hope. You don't tell your story, nobody will hear your story, and you won't heal from that story. So my dad always told me his story. So it goes back to Yelm, to the fishing rights, to that struggle, right? And that's a major part of it right there in the 60s to the 70s. Prior to that, it was the Treaty of 1855. McLeod is not a Nisqually name. McLeod come from John McLeod, who was an entrepreneur who came over here in the Hudson Bay Fur Company era. 1820 is when they landed here. That was some of the first documentation of that treaty and that trade that our people had. But it also shows, like I was saying, that openness and willingness. They surpassed all these other wetlands and came right here and landed right outside of DuPont. Why? Because this whole area right here was one vast territory of just beauty, they said. John McLeod was from Scotland. He was you just couldn't get on a boat and come over here to America in the 1800s. So he come from a prominent family over there that put him on this ship. He was actually a rancher, and there were 7 of them here in this territory. When they showed up here, they made a treaty with the Nisquallies. They had that handshake, and they traded, and they trapped, and we showed them how far up the mountain to go. Because those 25 villages that were located around this territory, every village had a purpose or a reason. Maybe there was a gathering going on. You know, when you start thinking about this healing, especially for myself when I was growing up, it had that nomadic feeling. I had to get up there. I had to be over here. I had to be out there in the water. I had to be in the stream, right? Just get in the water. Just put your feet in that water, is what I tell my kids. Because once you do that, everything just flows downstream with it. And you let go of that. That's that hope, we talk about. I always honor those elders, those fighters that we have. And doing that, we carry on this tradition that we are given. And I am a basket weaver because this is a healing tree. Medicine Creek treaty tree, the cedar tree. I could go down these lists of trees that we had in this territory that were really significant to us. That's why we signed that treaty under that grove of trees. And then you see these cedar trees around here, they're very powerful, very powerful. And if there's any advice I could offer to these, your sources here, you guys do great work, is that you take them out into this territory. Walk them through the bushes. Why? Because that takes it off. Those bushes and those trees take that. Better yet, sit on a rock. Why? Because the rock has to just sit there. Just like the tree. The tree just stands there. But they're there for a reason and a purpose. And that was taught to me again by an elder from Arizona. He was a Hopi native, Thomas Binyaka. He called him a prophecy teller. And he was. And that's what he would tell us young people, especially the ones that were hurting. Walk through there. You'll feel different coming out on the other side. So that work is here. That right here in this plant. I don't know, this one's plastic, but these plants right here. Could we get a real plant? No, just kidding. But again, it's my honor to come here and share that story and share some of that from right here. There's songs, there's words, but really, the prayer, it's right here in us. And my healing is that way. I open it up to that. We do a lot in our community over the last 10 years for a lot of that, and I'm grateful for that. So thank you again for all your work, and I'm honored to always come and speak, but I have to make sure it fits my schedule. But I do a lot of work for my Nisqually tribe around some of the history, some of the artwork, and some of the culture. And so that's one of my biggest key things I'm working on now in my life, is how to share this. I'm not selling my culture. I'm not selling my spirituality. I'm going to sell that experience you're going to get from who we are. And a lot of it already happens here. A lot of that interpretation is already going on. I want to create other interpreters in my kids. That's the goal. Your kids are interpreters too on how they tell this story. So remember that part of that when you're working with them. Oh, thank you. I don't want to take up too much time. I know I got the 5-minute back there, and I appreciate the time here of opening it up. So thank you.
Thank you. Not in my right page, sorry. One more. Okay, before you sit down, we have a gift for you. I want to thank you for your gift of coming today and sharing that with us. We are very grateful that you're here representing the Nisqually, and we want to commit to you to work together into the future. So I'd like to ask Cletus Nanabu, the manager of the Department of Labor and Industries Crime Victims Compensation Program, to help present this gift. I'm going to get out of your way. Sometimes the stage directions don't go exactly as you'd like, but that was very, very nice. Thank you, Cletus. And thank you again, Mr. Mcleod. I do want to note that Governor Jay Inslee has proclaimed in Washington State Crime Victims Week and encouraged us all to shed a light and provide support to those impacted by crime and violence and overcoming the traumas they face. It's right there. I won't read it to you. And we have copies of that as well. Before we continue, I'd like to acknowledge that Chief John Batista is here, And I want to thank you for all of your support and for coming out today. I will a little later in the program share some of the great work that the State Patrol is doing to help those impacted by crime and violence. And thank you, Joel, for helping us take a look back at the history of working with crime victims in our state. I'm just going to add a couple things. Nationally, the first crime victim compensation program started in California in 1965. A decade later, the first Victims' Rights Week was organized in Philadelphia, along with a host of other actions as a result of the women's movement to support victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. In the 1980s, the State Department of Corrections started the first victim notification program in the country. And the Office of Crime Victims Advocacy, my office, was created in 1990. By the 2000, crime victim liaison positions were established, again a national first through the Department of Corrections. But why hear me talk about the history of crime victim services in Washington State when we have someone here that's much more qualified to do that? It is my special honor today to introduce our keynote speaker, Bev Emery. Back in the 1980s, Bev began her work in the service of crime victims as the director of the Washington State Coalition of Sexual Assault Programs. Serving for nearly approximately 8 years, the coalition grew substantially, providing training and other services to crime victim advocates across the state. In 1990, when the Office of Crime Victims Advocacy was established, she was designated as its first director, which she served for nearly 25 years. During that time, I can't really get into the amount of growth that happened in that field, but it was substantial, including setting up the first ever statewide advocacy network of services to those experiencing crime and violence other than sexual assault and domestic violence. But again, I'm going too far in when we have Bev here, so please come on up, Bev, and please join me in welcoming her.
Good morning. It's always nice to be back in Washington, where Dawn and I can breathe a little bit of progressive air. After our retirement, we immediately moved to a cute little town in southern Utah, but it's in Utah. And I fondly think of them as being about 30 years behind you. So every time I come to Washington and I'm reminded of what you have done, I try to go home to Utah and say, it can happen, but it's obviously going to take a little longer. During my career in Washington and crime victim services, I always was aware of how special Washington was. I felt very fortunate to be just in the right place at just the right time, to see so many important things come to play in Washington in crime victim services. So I think that history is a very important thing to know and to actually study. From it, we can discover what pitfalls to avoid, but we can also see what paths to pursue based on what has happened before us. As mentioned already, I am grateful to those young civil rights leaders, to those anti-war movement leaders who really laid the groundwork for the women's movement, from which directly grew the anti-sexual assault and anti-domestic violence movements. History also provides perspective, though, and that often progress is hard to see in day-to-day, particularly for those of you who are providing direct services. It's easy to be overwhelmed by the pain and the volume of people who are victimized. But if you stay in your positions long enough, you do get to see change, and real change. We often were in the midst of a project and would pause for a moment and think, We couldn't even have had this conversation 10 years ago, let alone doing something about it. So from that past and that history, I hope that you draw hope for the future. As I think about Washington's history, and we were always acknowledged as being kind of different, and we would hear this whenever we went to national conferences, or we spoke on the phone to colleagues across the country, and certainly even from federal administrators. Washington was always different. They had something special. It was unique. As I think back to those, I think there are two factors that are critically important that helped that history become possible in Washington. One that's already been mentioned is collaboration. Collaboration that was built over time. The other is long-term leadership. Leaders who had a vision of how things could be and recognized that the advocacy community could be more successful, could gain more political power, could be more impactful through strategic alliances, all towards benefiting victims and survivors of crime. An early alliance was that between advocates, prosecutors, and law enforcement. And while it didn't come easy, we came to a place where we understood we were all in the same, had the same goal. We came from different perspectives, we had different roles, but we were all committed to no more victims. And then those alliances began to grow to include Crime Victims Comp, the medical community, therapists, and indeed all systems in which victims find themselves suddenly having to interact. From those alliances, collaboration actually began to grow. We were committed to each other. We were committed to learning how to work with each other, to achieve more for victim services. It certainly wasn't always easy, and it didn't mean we always agreed. Half the gray hair I have has CVC written on it. There were certainly strong and important disagreements, but it was always within the concept of collaboration, that we were going to stick with it, that we were going to keep talking to each other, that we were going to come to understand each other's perspectives and refocus our vision on improving services for victims of crime. We came to a collaboration that was strong and healthy and has survived for decades, that came to mean when one of us is victorious, it is a victory for all of us. When one of us struggles, we are all in the struggle. That became the standard. That became the expectation. We taught it to every new advocate coming into the field, and certainly to every new leader who came into leadership in an agency. This is the way it works in Washington. Then we had leaders who stayed in critical positions over time. They were able to not only ingrain that collaboration, but were there long enough to support systems that had been developed, to give them real stability, to help them grow roots that were strong and able to withstand the test of time. Accompanying that were local leaders in key organizations throughout the state, again, who stayed long enough to stabilize those organizations, to ingrain collaboration, to bring forth best practice, and to say, this is the way it's done. I'm now going to look at about 5 decades of history in about 5 minutes. So let's see if we can do it. I tried to choose some pivotal events that were so significant that they really changed the landscape of services, or they were an actual course correction that was really important to make. I also tried to pick events that demonstrate the value of collaboration and that long-term leadership. I think of the 1970s as really the grassroots beginning of crime victim services. It began with the first sexual assault program in Washington State and the third in the nation when Seattle Rape Relief came into being in 1973, followed shortly in 1975 by the founding of Families and Friends of Violent Crime Victims. You've already heard Joel mention that also the Crime Victim Compensation Program came into being. Towards the end of that decade, saw the creation of WCSAP, the Sexual Assault Coalition, and WISN, the Washington State Shelter Network, which was the precursor to what you now know as WSCADIV. That was an important time because there was statutory authority and attention and the government taking responsibility for the welfare of crime victims services, and for the first time allotted state money to local communities for those services. The 1980s was a time of growth and statutory framework. Advocates gained real political power. It became on the Hill, every time a bill came up that affected us, it was always asked, well, what do the advocates think? Have you talked to the advocates? Who are those advocates, by the way? It was a little bit of a mystique because there weren't very many of us then, but we had great telephone trees that could generate hundreds of calls into the legislature and created some of that political awareness and political power. Also in 1984 was the founding of the Washington Coalition of Crime Victim Advocates, that group that really looked for the interests of crimes other than sexual assault and domestic violence, and was another of the three of us in the advocacy community who did a lot politically, legislatively. The 1990s are sort of characterized by the focus on sex offenders, but it also became a time where research became important and we really grappled and got around the concept of evidence-based practice and began really instilling that in our programs. Based on two tragic events, the little Tacoma boy and the murder of Diane Balashotis, the Community Protection Act of 1990 became law, as well as its focus on sex offenders and all of those systems that go with it. The other thing that was created was the Office of Crime Victims Advocacy, another important piece to say within state government, we will have an office that actually advocates for and on behalf of victims of crime. One of the second or third in the country when it was created, and remains unique in its statutory responsibility to advocate. In the middle of that decade, we also had a sexual assault services plan, which was a gathering of sexual assault advocates from across the state who said, we know what survivors need, and we created standards and drove formula-driven funding. We made the bold statement and stood behind it that collaboration, not competition, was the way to ensure high-quality services for every victim everywhere. A little later in that decade, despite our best interests or our best intentions, we recognized that those standards were not especially applicable to communities of color, the disability community, and other diverse populations, and we made revisions and we made changes to better serve diverse populations. I think of the 2000s as a time when we really refined children's services and saw the emergence and awareness of human trafficking. We focused on child abuse and neglect. We understood domestic violence and its impact on children and started developing services to recognize that and help kids recover. And we certainly gave attention to children who had been sexually assaulted. From a 2001 study, we learned that of the 38% of women who experienced sexual assault in their lifetime, 80% of the time that first assault was before they reached their 18th birthday. This galvanized our attention on prevention and on children's services, and we started setting the standard for how kids needed to receive treatment. It also saw the creation of crime victim service centers. So now, at last, we had a complete network of sexual assault, domestic violence, and all other crime categories being served by an organized, formula-funded, standard set of organizations throughout the state. We also launched InfoNet, which was a state, for the first time in our history, statewide, unduplicated count of victims and the services they received. Data shifted from being a compliance exercise to one that actually informed communities and told the story of services and what was happening in that community, both at a community level and also at a statewide level. I think of the 2010s as one of transition, huge transition. I think of sexual assault particularly in this period of transition when we are saying the same things that we said 40, 30, 20 years ago, but now somehow they are understood in a deeply profound way. I think of movements like the Me Too movement as characteristic that we have actually gone from knowing what to say to be politically correct to actual fundamental cultural shift in sexual assault and the way we think about it. I think also of Washington and its tremendous transition in leadership in this decade and the couple of years upcoming. I left OCVA, Susan Hannibal at DSHS, Tom McBride at WAPA, Nan Stoops at Wuskadiv, Steve Ekstrom at DOC, Andrea Piper-Wentland at WICSAP. That's a lot of leadership at the same time. I think that means we're all about the same age. There are thousands of people and events that really go in and make up the history of Washington. And now that future lies ahead of you. What will your contribution be? Who will lead in 2020 and beyond? I've mentioned before that I think history gives us hope. And so do you and your work. Give me hope for the future. A future that reaches and serves youth who seem more connected to their electronic devices than to the people around them. A future that harnesses technology to enhance services and reach survivors we have never, ever been able to reach. A future that addresses and makes a shift in the impact of gun violence. A hope that this will be the last generation to walk behind the caskets of their classmates. A future that brings economic justice to survivors of domestic violence. And perhaps it is perpetrators who lose their housing and not victims. A future that enhances and strengthens collaboration in Washington, because I think it is the cornerstone of success. I hope one day that we will treat each other respectfully, kindly, and without violence. And if I had a moment to give you one little piece of advice, this would be it. In the words of my very favorite U.S. President, Jed Bartlett, just as he did, always, always ask, what's next? Thank you. There we go. You got it. Whoa.
Let's give Bev another round of applause. Thank you. Ooh. When I hear Bev speak, it reminds me of the job that I took on. It was an incredible job, and I didn't do it lightly. But I always find in her words inspiration for me to keep trying. And so thank you again. Okay, with that kind of foundation, I do think it's important to talk a little bit about what's happening now in Washington State. Joel spoke to the successes of the Labor and Industries Program, Crime Victim Compensation Program, and I'd like to add that the program is also working with prosecuting attorney offices across the state to roll out new security measures that will protect crime victims. Their documents used to determine restitution in criminal court cases. And I'm sure you're also aware of the sexual assault examination kit crisis that the country is experiencing. In Washington State, there are approximately 7,000 untested kits. Some of these go back to the 80s. When somebody who has been sexually assaulted has the courage and determination to undergo further trauma by an examination, we owe it to them to have those kits tested in a timely manner. Thank you. Through the collective efforts of many, including the Washington State Patrol, the Attorney General's Office, crime victims advocates, hospitals, legislators, and most importantly, victims and survivors who are willing to share their stories, significant steps have been taken to address this issue. We now have a statewide tracking system in place so that victims of sexual assault know where their kid is at any time. In 2017, the Attorney General's Office received a $3 million grant from the Department of Justice to help with that backlog to get those kits tested. Currently, as early as this week, the Senate, I believe, signed House Bill 1166, which is moving through with bipartisan support. And it's going to provide up to $13 million to hire new lab technicians at the State Patrol to get those kits tested. Yeah, it's a. I also just want to mention a couple other state agency efforts before we move on. The Office of Crime Victims Advocacy is partnering and has partnered with the Department of Health for several years to provide, to administer the Rape Prevention Education grant from the Centers for Disease Control. The Department of Social and Health Services, as for decades, run the Domestic Violence Shelter Program, a cornerstone of, as Bev said, of the work that's been done in Washington State. They're also a member of our Victims of Crime Act Executive Planning Committee. The Washington State Department of Corrections, our co-planners for today's event, started the Victim Services Program in the United States, and the first one in the United States in 1983, providing notifications regarding the release of incarcerated individuals. That's now grown to have 4 notification specialists and 6 victim liaisons who work across the state and provide, to address victim concerns and provide wraparound safety planning. That includes a coordinated team of professionals within the department to ensure the safety of the victim beyond the release of the perpetrator into the community. DOC also has more recently expanded to include a facilitated victim offender dialogue meetings and accountability letter bank accessible at the crime victim's request. And today, just yesterday, I think it was yesterday, Senate Bill 5649 passed, which extended the statute of limitations for sexual assault survivors to 20 years. Also eliminated the statute of limitations for child sex crimes. So I am going to thank you for all those efforts, and thanks for everybody being here today to support those. Your applause mean a lot to me, and just verify that that is really important work. So as we look towards the future, I am very happy to introduce Maddie Graves-Wilson. Maddie has been the Executive Director of Beyond Survival, Grays Harbor Sexual Assault Resource Center for the past 3 years. It is her belief that advocates serve the unique role of assisting victims with a powerful transformation into survivors. Over the years, Maddie has served her community in many roles, including child welfare, parent educator, and support for mothers with substance abuse disorder. Just recently, Maddie received her master's degree in social work. Congratulations. And it is my pleasure to introduce her. Please help me in welcoming her.
For the people that clap because I got my MSW, thank you. Because that was a long 3 years, guys. So I'm Maddie, as Rick said. I'm the Executive Director of Beyond Survival. We work out in Aberdeen, or Grays Harbor County, which is a giant county. So it's about the same size as King County, like area-wise, but we only have like 38,000 people, so we're all spread out. That's pretty great. So I've been doing advocacy now for about 8 years, and man, it's been quite a wild ride. The trauma that you get to witness and experience with survivors of sexual violence is an incredible, incredible thing. Not necessarily in a negative way, but just in a life-altering way of not only taking on the trauma of somebody else and being present with them during some of the most difficult times of their life, but also being able to take that experience and use it for betterment and empowerment of other women, children, men in your own life as you go on and serve others. So as our program has evolved with advocacy, in the past when I first started, it was a very much victims come to us type of program. They'll come to us if they need us. And I love that through social media and through other types of outlets and through the rise of technology, it's no longer if they will come to us. It's we are able to find them. We are able to find people that are struggling, that need support, that are isolated because of abuse or neglect or because of sexual assault and sexual violence. We're able to locate them and provide support through whatever means necessary. That might be a letter. It might be a phone call. It might be just sitting with somebody that is willing to make the journey to come in after being contacted by us through social media. So we've been able to create a community that is bound by outreach, which I so appreciate. Our community partners have expanded from just being law enforcement in the prosecutor's office to now we have programs like Camp Victory. That's a camp just for kids that have experienced sexual abuse so that they can feel comfortable staying overnight in a situation without their parent. We have programs that like YMCA after school program that want to partner with us to make sure that kids have the education necessary so that when they're put in those compromising positions of peer pressure, like send me those pictures, that they don't want to do it, you know, so that they're able to have the vocabulary and the knowledge necessary to say like, that's probably not the best idea for me. So that really just steps into the realm of prevention. What I'm really looking forward to over the next few years as advocacy continues to grow in these different ways are the breakdown of nonprofit leadership and public funding becoming more and more integrated with the private sector. The sexual violence movement has made a big ripple. The backlog and the Me Too movement and all of those things have really infiltrated the public in a really big way, so that it's not just us as public servants doing this work anymore. There's a lot of people out there that are like, how can I help? And I'm so excited that the awareness is now out there on a broader level. People can't claim ignorance anymore to the fact that this stuff is happening, and it's happening in a big way on a daily basis, and we should be doing something about it as humanity. So now we have the ability to go to people and say, hey, I have a survivor, lost housing. How can we partner with rental agencies? I have a survivor that lost a vehicle. How can I partner with the mechanic? I have a survivor that needs an attorney. How can we go about that? And because it's out there in a public way, we are so much more able to draw on media for a positive reason and bring that out and say, hey, like, have you seen this story? This is really important because this is an issue that my agency is dealing with, and we need to back these people up. We've done a lot of work over the last few years that I've been with Beyond Survival as a director and staff. When I first came on, I worked with Felice, who's going to be next, but on the Prison Rape Elimination Act work in local prisons. That really opened my eyes to the dynamics of sexual abuse with boys and men. Yes, we facilitate advocacy for folks that have been assaulted while in prison, but during my time doing that work, I've gotten to run trauma support groups for men at Stafford Creek Correctional Center. And let me tell you, the majority of men in my group were not assaulted in prison. They were assaulted during childhood and never received any of the tools and coping skills necessary to move forward from that abuse. And that's something that we really need to hone in and pay attention to. It is not just women and girls. Yes, it is a large majority, but we have men and boys that are victimized on a regular basis through not just at-home child sexual abuse, but also human trafficking. And we need to draw that out, and we need to pay attention to it. In addition to working with incarcerated survivors and men and boys, our county is located in the midst of several tribal communities. So we have the Chehalis tribe, the Squaxin Island tribe, as well as the Quinault Indian Nation. We have done our darndest as an organization, recognizing that the majority of us are not folks that identify as Native people, to work with them in partnership and community to share funding, to share sources, to share resources, whatever it might be, to make sure that folks in those communities are being reached and being served to the best of our ability within the cultural context that makes sense to them. So over the last couple of years, we've been able to run Native women's groups, which haven't been run out there since their program had shut down. It has recently restarted. But and we've been able to offer guidance and leadership and support for their for the Quinault Indian Nations program as they're rebuilding. And our hope is to not stay out there forever. Our hope is to build up leaders in those communities that can serve their own people the way that they deserve to be served. In addition to tribal communities, LGBTQ youth and adults have been a huge target for us. Being in a rural community, that's not always the safest environment for people that identify as something outside of a gender norm. And so we want to make sure that folks in that subcategory often understand that, hey, we are a safe place, that you are supported, and that you have people that are similar to you or that are that can identify with you in community with you. And we, because of not having necessarily the staff that identify in that similar way, work to locate volunteers and other community programming and partner with them to fund support groups or other types of events that they can put on for their community and really build up survivors that have experienced sexual violence. We go into K through 12 schools, and we teach prevention education as well. And let me tell you, it has been a whirlwind of an experience with that, because when we first started doing this a little over 5 years ago, we didn't think anything really of it, but as more and more kids started disclosing during our programming, you'd see their eyes get big and say, oh, that happens, and being able to teach them the proper way and the proper methods for schools to intervene and actually to report that type of abuse has been really beneficial for our community. We saw our numbers skyrocket a couple of years ago with how many intakes we did. We did over 150 kids in 1 year in terms of new child abuse intakes. And then as we've continued this programming, though, what we've noticed is that those numbers are slowly coming back to a normal state. And it's not necessarily that abuse isn't happening, it's that kids have the ability now to communicate. And just last week we saw a mom post that their daughter, after receiving prevention at her school, came home and said, hey, I need to tell you this. There's a kid looking at my butt and it made me feel weird. And I'm supposed to tell an adult if something makes me uncomfortable. So I'm like, it's working. Like, kids are getting the knowledge that they need, and we're getting the community involvement and the community buy-in and engagement that's really pushing our movement forward. And it's so, so exciting. So where do I find hope and inspiration for the future? So I'm really excited that it's not just people that look like me in my movement anymore. The people that look different than me have always been there and have not necessarily always been acknowledged. And I'm so excited that now I, as a white woman, am not just the face. Like, I'm so excited that I have people of color and people from other communities and backgrounds, and we are united as one moving forward. I'm so excited that, thank you. I'm so excited that my voice is just a voice, like not the voice in this movement, because disproportionality is real. It really is. And the fact that my experience as a survivor may be the same in terms of what happened, rape, but not the same in terms of what it meant moving forward. Justice for me may have been easier, and I feel like that is a complete disservice. I am so excited for this frickin' backlog stuff. Thank you for bringing it up, Rick. Like, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the studies, but multiple counties across the nation have been doing this backlog. And did you know that 50% of those cases, those logs, are being found in the CODIS DNA system? Like, so they're already known perpetrators of violence or crime. And then on top of that, another 25% of those identified are serial rapists. Like, that's insane to me. So I am really excited to see who goes down. I am like, so, and then finally, I'm so excited that trauma gets to be something that we get to frickin' talk about. Like, it doesn't have to be this thing that we bury within us and that we never bring to the surface. Instead, it gets to be something that's part of us, that we get to hold and mold and make what we want it to be. Because quite frankly, our perpetrators do not get to determine the rest of our lives. And with how this movement is going, with the new focus on adverse childhood experiences, with all of the trauma-informed services that are really being brought into this movement, that's what we get to do. We get to own it. It gets to be our fertilizer. I always tell my clients it's a S word, but I won't say that on camera. But we get to be the flowers that grow from that and like show our survivors the amazing opportunity that they get to have in post-traumatic growth, and that they can be voices not only for themselves or for their children or for their families, but they get to be a voice for the movement and for survivors everywhere, and they don't get to allow their perpetrator to dictate the rest of their lives. So that's what I'm excited for. Thank you, guys.
Thank you again, Maddie. Okay, now we come to the end of our program, a very important part of our program. The state agencies here and the advocates support crime victims, but it's the victims who must have the courage not only to overcome the trauma they have faced, but then to be open to the support that is available. One person who can provide a perspective from both sides is Felice Davis. Felice has worked for the Washington State Department of Corrections in a wide range of roles and is currently the Associate Superintendent of Programs at the Washington State Correction Center for Women. In these roles, she shares her own story of interpersonal violence in an effort to ensure that others going through similar experiences find community and support. So please welcome Felice Davis.
I was looking for this. Nope, not. Push the button. I pushed the button. It's half of the battle. Good morning. So I was asked to do this by one of my idols, Steve Ekstrom, several months ago. And I will be slow to start this morning. So I teach a lot and I speak a lot publicly. And often I'm the expert in the room about what I'm talking about, and often that's victimization. And for many years, I would have told you my job title, and that would have been the most important thing that I said to you. And I would have made you feel like it was just you, but I knew what was wrong with you. And that's super easy to do. And then one day, I'm going to tell this story way the wrong way. And then one day I got divorced. Ta-da! And I was sitting with a girlfriend, and she said, "Do you think you're being honest with the world about the way you're telling your story?" And I said, "Yeah, I think so. I've really excelled despite my past." And she used some cuss words, but the polite version of this is she said, no, you excelled because of your past, and you need to start being honest about that. And I suddenly found myself in a role at a women's prison where I was surrounded by women who had endured many of the same traumas that I had. And daily I was telling them what was going on with them, but I wasn't being honest with them. And then one day I had an opportunity to speak to them, and I started to reveal just a tidbit of my story. And it felt really good. Although I'll tell you, I went home that night and cried for a while and felt like my agency is gonna fire me because they're gonna suddenly figure out I'm a victim, and I work in a para-law enforcement agency where feelings aren't really the thing that you lead with. We don't talk about that, right? And a couple months went by and I didn't get fired, and that felt pretty good. And I thought, well, I'll probably never talk about that again. And then a leader hero to me called me privately and said, they're gonna do a TEDx at your facility. And you better speak. I know your story, so you're gonna do this. And I said, yeah, I'm gonna talk about prisons and prison history, and it's gonna be really interesting. And he was like, okay, that's not what I'm asking you to do. And I decided in 2014 that I would share on the TED stage that I had gone through a great deal of my own victimization, and that I wouldn't be nearly the hero to people that I could be if I would just reveal who I actually was. So I stood on that stage and I talked about 19-year-old victimization. I talked about the 3 years that I endured with my abuser as a teenager. I talked about getting pushed from a window and the day that he held a gun to my head. And it was awful and freeing, like unbelievably freeing. Now I'm crying on stage. Well, that's a thing. But the most important part of that talk was not all of the trauma And all of the details don't really matter because in some way they give him some acknowledgement that he simply doesn't deserve. What I found from that day was that I opened doors. My silence had been oppressive. My silence had held me back from being the leader that I could be. Days later, I started getting calls because, of course, this thing goes on YouTube, which meant that like suddenly people who didn't know me were looking for me on LinkedIn and watching this talk and saying like, hey, I felt a lot like you. Can we talk? And I've met over the past 4 years with men who have lived in their shame, leaders in police agencies who are now using my video for their training to start dispelling myths about who victims are. Because believe it or not, they didn't see my face as possible as a victim. Victims, in their opinion, weren't strong. I wanted to break the silence and did, and I continued to want to break the silence because there's been so much power in the conversations that I've been able to have with women and men. There's been so much power in who I've become as a mother and a leader, in being authentic and honest. I've read a lot of Brené Brown over the last couple of years. And my favorite quote of hers, and the people who know me in the room just laughed, because daily I say, like, you should read Brené. Brené knows. She does. What she says is that daring greatly means the courage to be vulnerable. It means to show up and be seen and to ask for what you need, to talk about how you're feeling and to have the hard conversations. I've now spent 4 years having those hard conversations. I have better links and depth of character. I am able to have really difficult conversations with people who know I authentically believe in and love them. I have engaged my community differently. I had been involved in domestic violence and sexual assault advocacy work for almost 20 years when I shared that story. But I had never shared those stories. And out of it has come so much connection, community, so much belonging for people who are able to come to me and say, hey, I didn't feel like I belonged. I didn't feel like I could have this conversation, but now I know I can. And I didn't see that day as brave. I saw it as me freeing all of those secrets. And I can't tell you how good that felt. And I would encourage people not maybe to do it on a TED stage, but disclosure to someone is so incredibly important. What I would ask of you today is that if you need that person, you reach out. Find somebody who will listen. Do not believe for one moment that you can keep that story inside and that you're going to succeed despite your story. We are heroes because of our stories. Also, be there. Just be there. Be willing to hear people. Be willing to sit and listen, which often we're bad at. And help people reframe their story. We recently brought in a program at the women's prison, and it's a film writing program, which sounds really benign. But it's not, because we write our stories, and when we write our stories in film, and they told me this, and it's ruined all movies for me, so I'll do that for you. There's always a character who faces a challenge and then figures out that challenge. At the beginning of my story, before I told it publicly, I felt a lot like if I lived in secret, I could excel. My challenge was sharing my story. I had given him a lot of power for a lot of years around what he had done. But what I had done was so much more important. At 16 years old, I figured out how to get away from an abuser who was bound and determined to kill me. At 16 years old, I was stubborn. I'm now raising stubborn children. But I also walked away and owned this story. And the film writing is teaching me, and hopefully many decades of women, if this sustains, that they're heroes in their story and they get to decide how to write the ending of their story. So I encourage you to either rewrite your story to be your own hero or help somebody see that they're a hero. Thank you so much.
So one of the tasks I was given going into today's speech was to find a call to action in some of the presentations. And I think I just found it, and that was be there and listen. I know your speech was so much more than that, but that really stuck out to me as people in the field trying to do good work and help. It has been such a pleasure to listen to our presenters today. I'd like to thank Hanford Mccloud, Bev Emery, Maddie Wilson-Graves, and Felice Davis. Let's give them one more round of applause, please. I also want to thank all the people that put this event together. From Department of Labor and Industries, we had Brian Frasina, Kaylee Davis, Brianna Perry, Tiffany Dixon, and what's that guy's name back there? Matthew Ehrlich. And then from the Department of Commerce, my department, Melissa Krause, Megan Basquette, thank you very much. And then from the Department of Corrections, Sheila Llewellyn and Felita Lupa. And I'm sure I'm probably forgetting some folks, but all the folks that came and made this all possible. So with that, I just want to thank everybody again for your time and for being here. Have a great day. Thank you.